Debbie and Jen are doing a great job trying to shoo everybody back. We've got a great set of discussions this afternoon, and we will be done by 4 to give you some time to go out and enjoy the rest of the day and see what else is happening as it relates to the Global Climate Action Summit. So as we bring in our panel, I want to share with you we've got a really good panel on governance, and James Nachbauer will explain to us what governance means in this context, and then have a conversation with this panel. Then we'll have a short break followed by more conversation. So without further ado, I'd ask James to come up, and James is one of the leaders at the State Water Board here in California. And so he's done a lot of work putting together this panel, and we welcome you, James. Thanks.
Thank you. So I had some slides for the AV folks. But basically, I've attended a couple events over the course of the week, and I was listening in this morning, and I've been really struck by the complexity of climate change and of all the solutions, the actions, the ideas. These all are really complicated. I've heard a lot over the course of the week around technology, around finance. We heard this morning around information and governance as well. The focus of this panel is on sort of the human complexity of climate change and water and governance. And we're focusing on culture and governance issues at the water climate nexus. So for me, governance is kind of hard to define, but it is different from government. Governance is sort of the sum total of all the different forces at play in a situation. It can be corporate actors, it can be non-governmental organizations, it can be government at many different levels, from the UN down to a community organization, and how they all interact and how they all affect each other. And it's around who has authority to do what and how decisions get made, the processes for changing those rules, and it's this messy, complicated, nested, invisible thing, and yet it shapes a lot of our lives. Next slide, please. Okay, so I've got 6 amazing speakers here, and we're going to be sharing a number of stories with you. And I'm hoping to have a dialogue among each of our speakers and also a dialogue between all of us and all of you. The cases they're explaining, the stories they're explaining are not simple, and that's why we picked them. These are not cases where you have a single issue, not cases where you have a single body that has the responsibility to solve the problem. These are not places where you have a single goal or a single clear way to address conflicts that arise. There's not a single approach that is clearly going to work. There's not even one value system that everybody agrees to. There's no one place that decisions are getting made, and there's not one community that's being affected. These are all messy, complicated areas. Next. So themes I want you to listen for are across all 6 of these speakers and anything you want to volunteer. And again, people in the back, come on up. We've got empty seats here. What I want you to listen for is processes that have helped build trust, helped build the capacity to solve problems, help improve the equity of various outcomes, and let people actually see a greater set of what's possible. Next. Aha, thank you. So, again, we've heard a lot of interesting ideas, but you need to keep in mind that the ideas, whether it's a financial solution or a technical solution that you think might apply in a particular place, maybe will, maybe won't, but whether it does or doesn't is going to be a function of the culture and the governance in effect in that place. And so you need to be aware of that, so you can either change the governance or try to change the culture, or you can try to change your ideas to fit. The other key lesson I want here is for us all to think more broadly about the governance and cultural context that we operate in, because these can constrain what we think of as possible. When people talk about climate change, you often hear people say, humanity can't plan ahead, or humanity can't solve collective action problems or deal with common pool resources. And I just want to correct that a little bit and say, that our culture can't currently do these things, but that there are plenty of examples from around the world of groups that have been able to manage resources for centuries, of people that can work together across very difficult differences. And so, your view of human nature needs to be broad. We need to think creatively. We need to be inspired by ideas from all around the world. We were going to end with the water bar, but since we had our water bar at lunch, we will hear more about that. And here is our panel. So I wanted to start by asking each of them to explain one or two cases that they'll be revisiting again and again for the next 2 hours. So why don't we start at the end, I guess, and work this way. We'll start with Chris. Actually, would you be okay sitting there? Yeah, sure. All right. That way we'll minimize transitions.
All right. Can people hear me? That's fine. My name is Chris Finlayson. I'm a member of the New Zealand Parliament. I'm now in opposition, but for 9 years I was Attorney General and Minister for Treaty of Waitangi negotiations, and I'll explain what that is in a minute. But because it's Maori Language Week in New Zealand and we're trying to revitalise our mother tongue, as it were, I should greet you in the language, the first language of my country. Raurangatira mā tēnei taku mihi atu kia koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. And that simply means to all the distinguished people gathered here today, I acknowledge you, I acknowledge you, I acknowledge you. So I became Minister for Treaty of Waitangi negotiations, and basically what my country has been engaged in for about 25, 30 years is a process of dealing with the past as best we can and dealing with historic grievances that have occurred between the Crown or the state of New Zealand and the Indigenous people. And so in 1840, a treaty was signed between Queen Victoria and the Maori of New Zealand, and essentially it extended to the various tribes around New Zealand. The individuals had all the rights and obligations of British citizens, and the Crown said that it would look after the treasures of the Maori, the forests, the lands, the lakes, and so on. And over a period of colonisation, promises that had been made were not kept, land was taken, people turned into bystanders as they looked at their natural resources being denuded. And one particular area that I was engaged in was my negotiation with the people of a beautiful river called the Wanganui River, a river that flows from the central North Island of New Zealand down to the Tasman Sea. And I'll just read you a very ancient saying of the people of the Wanganui River, the tribes of the Wanganui River, when I was dealing with them in negotiations, and it essentially says, "E reriko mai te awa nui nei, mai te kahui monga ki Tangaroa, ko o te awa ko o," which means the river flows from the mountains to the sea. I am the river is me. And as a person who was very much in the Anglo-Saxon legal tradition, when I became a minister, I heard that and said, well, what sort of planet are we all on? It doesn't sound to me to be a particularly practical way of proceeding to negotiate a historic settlement with these people. But as the negotiations went on, I began to understand the inextricable link between the Indigenous people of the Wanganui River and the river. They'd lived along the river for generations. It had been their source of food, their source of recreation, and they were utterly intertwined with it. And so in the course of negotiations, we got away from odd Western legal concepts of saying who owns the bed of the river, who owns the water, who owns the water, the column above the river. because to speak of a river in that way is slightly mad in my view. And so we adopted a far more unified view of the river. And so basically what we've done is pass legislation to give effect to a settlement that recognises the river as an indivisible whole, running from the mountains to the sea. And so we've granted legal personhood, or not we, the New Zealand Parliament has granted legal personhood to the river, and the river will be represented in a practical way in various resource hearings, for example, by two representatives who are both very distinguished leaders or representatives of the Maori tribes who live along the river. So essentially that's the sort of work that we've been engaged in. As I said to someone before lunch, it really is the education of a public man, because what you're trying to do is get away from purely Western concepts of looking at natural resources, taking into account what the Indigenous people have said, and come up with a mechanism that will address some of the environmental concerns about the particular natural resources that we promised the Maori we would do in 1840. So I'll leave it at that and can explain further later on.
Well, thank you. My name is Shanai Matteson, and thank you to James and to everyone who's helped to put this event together. I'll admit I was a little surprised to be invited to speak on a panel about governance. I'm an artist, public artist. My background is in environmental education and cultural organizing, and I'm here to talk about that intersection with climate and water. I'm one of the co-founders of Water Bar and Public Studio. We're an artist-led benefit corporation, which I'm happy to talk more about what that structure is as an entity. But we serve water. That's our mission, and that's what we do. We have a tap water bar in Minneapolis on the Mississippi River. So we think about how to utilize that social space and that cultural space that artists and communities create together to help people reconnect with where their water comes from and the many stories around that. And how can we use arts and culture? How can we collaborate better through thinking about the work that we do as all being rooted in culture? Those are the kinds of things that we think about. So when we talk about why we serve water, we do that to build relationships. That's the main thing. And that those relationships are really about transforming the cultures of collaboration. So we work in collaboration with government at the local level, everyone from our neighborhood organization all the way up to our state government. Anna Henderson is here from our Governor Mark Dayton's office, and she was bartending a little bit earlier today at the Water Bar. And I'm going to be talking about what we do at Water Bar, but also we are just one example of many, many artists and cultural organizations working in places, rural, urban, tribal communities, who are doing this important work of helping to change our culture and shift our culture. I will also mention, because I think you did such a great job of grounding the work that you do in place, that in Minnesota, we are in Minnesota. So Mini is a Dakota word, and the Dakota people are the first people of the intersection of the Mississippi River and Minnesota River, which is the Bedote. And we have a version of Water Bar that we do in collaboration with the Dakota Language Society and a Healing Place Collaborative, which is an Indigenous artist-led collaborative that Water Bar is a part of. And when we do that, we do Maniaway. So Maniaway is a Dakota word that means a place to gather water. Because it's a Dakota word and concept that, of course, has many layers to it. It's not simply a tap that you turn on. It's a place where you go to connect with the vital aspects of life and place. And so I can talk a little bit about Maniaway, about Water Bar, and other work we're doing with and in the communities we're part of.
Thank you. My name is Alice Hill. I want to thank James and the team for inviting me here today. I examine climate change from a national security perspective. I served on President Obama's team on the National Security Council, where I was Senior Director for Resilience Policy. And we looked at the risks to the United States from drought and other issues, but also internationally what can occur when freshwater supplies dwindle and dry up. So I wish I had for James the good news stories, but I'll tell you two stories that certainly motivated actions under President Obama to create an executive order requiring all security-oriented agencies to look at the risks from climate change to our national security. President Trump has revoked that executive order, but there is still work within the federal government looking at these issues. And probably the two most dramatic case studies for this are Lake Chad, the freshwater basin of Lake Chad, which since 1960 has, it provided freshwater. It was the largest freshwater lake in Africa and provided water to many millions of people in surrounding areas. And mostly through mismanagement of the water supplies since the 1960s, it's been depleted by 90%. Which has meant the people move in closer, a lot more conflict over the water. About 15% of that shrinkage has been attributed to climate change. As a result of the tensions of people moving because they didn't have access to the water and a variety of food and water insecurity, movement to urban areas in search of better conditions, certainly Boko Haram was given a fertile territory to grow there and recruit. And of course, Boko Haram spread and has been a major challenge within the area. And Boko Haram used the crisis from the water to recruit. They could provide food, education, and more security to the local population. The UN has recognized Lake Chad as a region that has been threatened by climate change, its security, and has invested deeply in a variety of efforts, and there have been some successes in containing the challenges there. But at its root, it's a water challenge and a population challenge and a food security challenge, but water is at the core. Then similarly, for a major threat area to the United States, and you heard a bit about this in your earlier, certainly the relationship between Pakistan and India. Pakistan is, of course, an important ally for the United States, but it is one of the most natural disaster-prone countries in the world. It is suffering from climate change, which is causing some very extreme flooding. As a result of the government's inability to address those challenges, it has allowed, at least anecdotally, terrorist organizations to, similarly to Boko Haram, recruit as a result of the inability of the government to take care of people in crisis. But importantly, it also shares waters with India, with whom it has a very difficult relationship. They're two nuclear powers, and India has threatened to build dams that will reduce the amount of fresh water to Pakistan, which is already, it also suffers from drought and lack of fresh water, and then this flooding. So from a national security perspective, that's of grave concern, is what will happen as Pakistan, which does not have the type of government that can respond easily, faces these crises, and how will they ensure the freshwater supplies to their population. So I wish I had the answers. There are many efforts ongoing. Certainly many NGOs are working on trying to find solutions in these areas, and sometimes they're obviously more welcome than government entities are. So hopefully they will be successful. I think the ones that I've had the honor of speaking with say it's, as probably true everywhere, it's a lot about building trust, and that everyone has trust in each other and voices are heard. So these are two areas to watch closely. So thank you.
Hello, my name is Jamilet Carrillo, or Jami. and I'm a conservation scientist at the I'm a conservation scientist. I work at the International Community Foundation based in National City, but most of my work is about the Colorado River as it crosses or not into Mexico. So the story that I would like to share with you throughout these 2 hours in different formats is about a river that ran dry, that didn't cross the border into Mexico for decades, that was this type of sad stories. The floodplain is really just dry sand most of the time, as the river that used to reach the Delta, the Sea of Cortez, the Gulf of California, is most of the time like this with a lot of invasives like the salt cedar growing around. So what happened to the communities down there in Mexico? And what can we be doing together as 2 nations sharing a watershed, a basin, 30 million people depending on this river, and very little is known about the impacts, ecological, social, socioeconomical, of a river running dry in general, especially on its last portion in its delta. So when I began working in the Delta, it was about 18 years ago, and I began working with the Kukapa tribe. It's a tribe, their name means people of the river, and Onesimo, back then he was the traditional chief of the Kukapa tribe in Mexico. It's a tribe that has communities on both sides of the border, in the US, in Somerton, Arizona, but also in Mexicali, in Baja California, and in San Luis, in Sonora, on the Sonora side. So it's a very interesting community that grew and developed their traditions, their language, and their survival around the river, as many other tribes in the US along the Colorado River. And I was just a volunteer, and I learned from them what it meant for the river to slowly lose its life in the Delta, and how its own community was beginning to dwindle and lose their capacity to survive and to maintain their identity and their language. But one of the things that I work at the most on these 18 years has been on restoring in-stream flows and hopefully getting a river to flow back through the Delta and into the Gulf of California. And in that, we know in Mexico that we cannot make it alone, that we needed the whole work and the collaboration to be built and the trust to be created across the watershed in both countries, regardless of the differences in language and in culture and in legal frameworks and in socioeconomic and markets and everything. And the story that I would like for you, or the lesson, or the many lessons that I learned from this work that I've been doing in restoring in-stream flows to the Delta is, it is doable. Despite all the odds, despite all the differences and the political agendas and the state of our governments, there has to be always a way, and it usually begins through communities. This effort in the Delta, it began with really binational organizations, environmental organizations that work on both countries, began talking to each other on how to restore the Delta ecosystem, how to restore this river together. Then scientists from universities on bordering states on both the US and Mexico joined the movement. And then the governments, both federal governments of Mexico and the US, they have a treaty. It's a 1944 water treaty. And they have a way of communicating whatever happens with the Colorado River and 2 other rivers, the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo, or the Tijuana River. But there are 6 rivers that cross the borders, north to south or south to north, along the US-Mexico border, and this treaty only covers 3. One of the Colorado River one is the one that it's born in the Rocky Mountains, crosses this iconic, beautiful place that's the Grand Canyon. And unfortunately, very few people that have enjoyed the Grand Canyon or the river or rafting through the river can imagine what it feels like to see the Colorado River just as a dry sand floodplain, without flows. And I have seen it upstream, downstream, but I have also seen it as the last dam of the river opened 2 gates out of 35, and water began flowing through it in 2014 with the pulse flow. And I think that gave me hope, and that's what I would like share with everybody else that works in tough situations, tough rivers and watersheds and basins. It can be done. Little by little, have patience, build trust, establish ways of communication, talk to one another. Sooner or later, you will have different tools that you can use. It can be scientific tools, community organizing tools, educational tools. But the most important thing is, if you believe in something, if it brings health to the ecosystem and to the local communities, it can be done. It may take some time. It may take some 18 years for you to begin seeing the fruits of your work, but it can work. These are some of the projects, restoration projects, some stretches of the river in Mexico. We have begun restoring in-stream flows through market-based mechanisms in the irrigation district in Mexico. And we hire local communities. People are really seeing that it pays to work in restoration and that is feasible. And also, at the end of the day, what we have been seeing is very nice places in the Delta are beginning to be restored. Maybe we cannot restore the whole river for the whole time, but we can find very nice places where the river becomes a river or a small creek, and where we have native riparian cottonwood willow areas, and where we have communities and people in the community employed and enjoying the benefits of restoration.
Manahu means hello. Inanine, my name's Harry Williams. I'm from Owens Valley, Bishop, California. We're restoring our name, Payu Hudanu, because I'm tribal. I've been faced with many issues in my life. Growing up in a community that later on in life I realized that we supplied LA, Los Angeles, with basically with 70% of their water, now about 50% of their water. But the damage done in all of the government, when I was kind of surprised out in this governance things too, because I've seen it work good and bad. It was just like, and I've also just, I was on the Owens Valley Committee for 20 years, learned all about the issues. And myself, I'm on a committee and being in an area that many of you will not be faced with the issues we've been faced with. We have been faced with overpumping. Owens Lake, if you know that, biggest PM10, 2.5, being blown off in a big institution like LA down there saying, no, it's not a problem. Well, it was. When you can't see, if you've ever been in Owens Valley, when you can't see the mountains, you know you got a problem. And there's so many laws and they're being reversed today. And it's sad because I look at everything, not just an Owens Valley problem, but a world problem. I look at Mother Earth as she's given us everything. And the legends of the past and the words of my ancestors, they said, Mother Earth is the only one that ever give us anything, so that's who we pray to. And if you don't take care of Mother Earth, she won't take care of you. And that is exactly what's happening today. We're not taking care of her or damaging her. We're treating her like just a resource or a commodity. That can't keep going on. Because Mother Earth will react, and she will react like the balance of time. For every action, there's an equal opposite reaction. If we was in North Carolina today, we'd exactly know what's happening. And many of the people here from around the world, and they know what's happening. But some people don't care because they're capitalists, and all they care about is money. Well, I can destroy an area, water, land, soil, but I'll go back home. Well, some of us stay in these areas. We will continue to stay there. It's my home. I look at everything as a homeland. And when somebody drags so much water, like especially the Owens Valley, when they pumped all this water, they also sucked the color and life out of an area. And that's where I look at things, respect, total respect for Mother Earth. And that's not being given. And that's why I'm really glad that Governor Brown and whoever else put on this event, really that they did it so we could get to talk about it. Because if you don't talk about it, then you ignore it. We can't ignore it. If you're on the East Coast, you wouldn't ignore it. You may be a climate denier and going like, oh, it won't hurt me. But then some of the scientific facts are simple. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And that's what's happening today. The seas have raised by 1 degree centigrade, but it put 7% more water in the atmosphere. Isn't that just simple to understand? But some people don't. Some people don't care. And that's why I'm really glad I was invited here, because I like talking about it. I've been faced with stuff in Owens Valley to where in 1895, LA could only grow to 250,000 people. They realized the water in my area, 300 miles south, they pumped it and built an aqueduct. But what it did was suck the color and life out of my area and took it to LA. And I am faced with the political system and the non-caring, sometimes the government. I always looked at the government when I read the Constitution was equality, equal, we're all equal. But at times, being Native, we've never been treated equal. Until 1924, we were finally considered citizens of the United States. Isn't that a big wake-up call for some people? And if you really looked at history, the doctrine of discovery, that was a murderous thing. They just said, if you don't believe my religion, then you're less than me and I have a right to kill you and steal your land. Well, that's what they did, and they're still doing it. But I'm more scared about today. We've overpopulated. We've overpopulated, and that's kind of sad, because I see all the hurt that people get put through when there's too much. Because like I'll say again, if you don't take care of Mother Earth won't take care of you. And that's what's happening, and that's what I see what's happening. And there's cases all over the world. I like it that New Zealand has stood up. These people are standing up, and you guys are here. Because we need to educate the rest of the world.
Good. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Martin Marani. I'm from the University of Nairobi. And I like talking about governance issues, particularly about the environment. My story is going to be about this river here. This is the what we call the River Tana in Kenya. It is the most important river in Kenya. It supplies about 70% of all Kenya's energy. It supplies about 80% of all the water to Nairobi City. Just a little geography about the river. The river runs from the mountains, in particular here, Mount Kenya, all the way to the Indian Ocean, 1,000 kilometers. Along, within these 1,000 kilometers, the river serves various interests. And maybe I can just tell you a little about the interests. In the mountains, we have some of our most important conservation areas, parks. And downstream in the middle, we have pastoralists, herders, who really need this water. And further downstream, we have indigenous groups who need this water for various uses. So one of the interests, as I've said, is the government. The government needs this water to be able to promote various development needs. Now, we also have interest from the energy people. We have interest, as I've said, from water supply. And we also have interests for the various communities, as I've said. So the question here, or the challenge here, has been the various competing interests. Yes, we have various competing interests. Each of these interests is looking for a little more water. Yes, you find energy, they want a little more water. You find Nairobi wants a little more of this water. The herders, the cattle keepers, they want a little more of this water. The cultivators, whom I've said are mostly in the upper and middle basin, they want a little of this more water. So everybody's wanting a little more. That's really the challenge. But the river has been undergoing a lot of degradation, mostly due to increasing population. More people are taking up land, riparian land, and settling on it. And therefore, there is a lot of degradation. There is a lot of unlicensed withdrawals. And therefore, there is less and less water all the time. That's what has happening. So on one side, you have everybody wanting a little more of it. On one side, the volumes are going down. And therefore, the next challenge is, how do people try to get what they want out of this scenario? Power will want more water because they're building a new dam to generate hydropower. Nairobi wants more water because it has more people settling in the city through the rural-urban migration. And everybody else, as I've said, wants more of this. So what have we been trying to do about this? Now, we have been trying to work, or rather, I'm saying we because my colleagues and myself, we've been trying to work on how do these interests play out, who gets what they want, and how. And in trying to propagate these interests, how do the stakeholders consider climate change? So those are some of the things we have been working on. So who wins and who loses in this scenario? We have also tried to work on those kind of issues. And so it's a kind of a complex scenario, a complex landscape where everybody wants what they want, and they go out to ensure they get it using different tactics. Let me put it like that. And so we have actually come to that. Now, the governance scenario, as I've said, is getting very, very, excuse my English, please. Sorry. The governance scenario is getting very, very complicated. If it goes the way it's going, it's going to be very difficult even to make decisions on how to use the river. For example, of late, projects which were planned to supply Nairobi with water have been delaying because of these same competing interests. If the government tries to build a dam, it's going to meet a lot of resistance from the local people, who also say before the water can go to Nairobi, because the water is going to Nairobi like 200-300 kilometers away, they're saying first it must meet our needs before it can go to Nairobi. And government is trying to overcome that. Yeah, government is trying to overcome that, and it's been a little bit complicated because now we have new laws that give communities certain rights over their water. And so, unlike the past, because in the past when the government built a dam, it went and took land by force. It also took the water, maybe by force. But this time, communities can go to court. They can challenge government action. And quite often the court may rule in their favor. Yeah? And so I want to finish by saying that this is getting more and more complicated. Nairobians are now going through a very rigorous rationing of water because of delayed projects, as I've said. And people are asking, what next? Does it mean that this city is going to come to a halt? A city that controls more than half of the Kenyan economy is going to come to a halt because of no water or something like that. So those are some of the issues that we are following at the moment. Sorry if I was incoherent. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you. That was. So my intention was to have this be as interactive and lively as possible. So I'd like to turn to the panel and invite you all to ask, do any of you have any questions about each other's cases? Yes.
I would like to ask Chris about how difficult or how easy was giving personhood to a river, because I think that was a key thing.
Well, I think a lot of my cabinet colleagues thought I'd gone troppo, and certainly we don't actually have the KKK in New Zealand, but I started, last week I got an email from someone describing me as the enemy of the people, and one extremely lovely person wrote to me once and said after the Wanganui River settlement, why don't you get cancer? How dare you give property rights to people above their station? So you get various kinds of reactions, but it's interesting, by and large, when you explain the concept to people and they get away from the novelty of it, they begin to see that it's got a bit of common sense to it. The great thing about the Pacific region is that I picked up some ideas from, who was it, Christopher Stone, who in the 1970s was writing at UCLA or somewhere about whether or not natural resources could be given this level of protection. Can forests have legal personality, I think was the one of his articles. And when you think about it, we incorporate societies, we form companies to do particular things, we establish charitable trusts. So the whole idea in Anglo-American law of the corporate identity is applying it to natural resources is not as strange as it sounds. And as I said, for many years in my country, the particular people who lived along the river brought cases to all the courts of New Zealand, and at one stage they went off to what was called the Privy Council in London, which was the final court for Kenya and New Zealand and other former colonies, and they were debating issues like, well, who owns the bed of the river and who owns the water? And if you dissect a river like that, well, that's a pretty odd idea as well, rather than looking at it in a holistic kind of way. So the short answer to your question is yes, there was a reaction against it, but once people started to think about it, they saw that it wasn't a completely batty idea and had a lot of merit.
I'd also like to say thank you for giving the rest of the world that idea, because, you know, everybody should respect every living being in the world. So you got anything else to say? How do we push America that way?
Well, I don't know that we've necessarily given the idea to the rest of the world. There's been a bit of a debate in India about whether the Ganges should be recognised as a legal person, and I think the Supreme Court said no, although a provincial court said yes. And I know from some of my friends in other tribes, I was wanting to talk to someone before I came up here, and she said, look, sorry, we're tied up talking to some people from Ecuador about the giving nature some standing and some rights. So I don't think there's actually anything new under the sun, and different jurisdictions are approaching it in different ways, but getting away from, if you like, old Anglo-Saxon concepts of property, and trying to hear what other people are saying and incorporating those ideas into structures is quite a useful way of going.
This actually speaks really well to the example that I mentioned of the version of Water Bar that we do called Mania Way with the Dakota Language Society. We have a tagline at Water Bar that is the only script we ask our bartenders to use, which is "Welcome to Water Bar, water is all we have." When we do Mania Way, the Dakota speakers who are the bartenders like to open with the line, "Water is not a resource, it's a relative." Which speaks to this idea. And we've found that we can bring that as an arts and culture project to spaces like this, where there are a lot of people who are thinking about policy mechanisms and other ways of working with water, thinking about water, and that simple introduction of that idea, water is not a resource, it's a relative, in a space where people call themselves water resource experts, actually is the spark for a really good conversation. And so we do that over water. So we're actually drinking water from the river, from the ground, when we have that conversation, which is another shift. I mean, how many of us have water conferences and conversations like this where we're not actually intentionally drinking water? I mean, we might be drinking bottled water, but we're not actually talking with the very thing that we are there to talk about. So.
I have a question for my fellow panelists. I am a former judge, and we talked a little bit about the courts. Do you think that the courts will be an asset in solving the governance challenges that we have in sharing water?
Okay.
Whoever.
Thank you. I think there are debates on that. That is debatable. Let me give a little what I have learned from the Kenyan scenario. One is that environmental education in Kenya is relatively new. It's relatively new. These are relatively new arguments in court. And because of that, we don't have so many competent lawyers who can go to court and argue environmental issues. Recently, one of the very renowned poachers, somebody who poaches elephants and rhinos, these are really endangered species in Kenya, was arrested, was put in. I mean, after litigation, he was jailed for 20 years. That's what the law says. The law says up to 20 years maximum. And maybe with a fine of up to around 20 million Kenya shillings. But after being in jail for 2 years, he appealed the case. And the judge who listened to the case ruled in his favor. And so he was released. And I was monitoring what people were saying on social media, Facebook, WhatsApp, and so forth. And most people seemed to say judges do not understand environmental issues, and they are, Kenyan judges, and they are not the best placed to make decisions, particularly good decisions on environmental issues. In fact, some people are suggesting that they need serious training. Yes, that they need serious training because the law school where they came from, the oldest law school is my university, University of Nairobi Law School, does not emphasize environmental issues. It doesn't, they don't teach much of environmental law, except a few things on treaties, environmental treaties and so forth. It's not like taught from a deep perspective. That is one. Another case has been that we want to establish, Kenya wants to establish a coal power plant at a place called Lamu. Lamu is one of the very cultural islands of Kenya. In fact, it has annual cultural festivals that attract the whole world to the place every year. And the community has been resisting this. All the plans were approved. It's a project that is being pursued by, I think, 3 companies, a Kenyan company, a Chinese company, and I think a company from one of the European countries. And people have been resisting this. The matter is still in court, but the way things are going, I see the court ruling that the project will continue. And so, coming back to the question, I think I agree that lawyers, the bench, let me now use a little of law language. The bench and the bar, that is the judges, magistrates, and lawyers in court. I think in my view, without training, they will always make decisions, or often make decisions, that do not consider sustainability issues. The term sustainability is not well considered in most of the court decisions. And therefore, they are simply looking at this as a criminal case. They're not looking at, for example, the impact on communities, what communities are going to lose, what the country is going to lose, because for us in Kenya, we pride in our elephants, we pride in our rhinos, and we have international conventions on rhinos and elephants are some of the laws that we really enforce strictly. We better arrest you with maybe an antelope. That one we might think twice and we can say, okay, you can go. But if we arrest you with an elephant tusk or a rhino horn, then you are in serious trouble. This is not going to be a joke. Yeah? Yeah? So those are some of the things that the sustainability argument is not deeply entrenched in court decisions. That's one of the things. Now, when it comes to, just quickly, when it comes to a case like I mentioned in the Tana, where we have different stakeholders who have competing interests. Yeah, they have competing interests. And 2 government agencies that have competing interests. Let me give you an example. The power sector need more water to go downstream to run the turbines so that they can produce more power. More power will translate into more revenue. But upstream, you have Nairobi interests wanting to channel this water to Nairobi. And the demand is rising very fast. In the next few years, it will be around 1 million cubic meters. And so power is saying, look, we need this water to come downstream. So you guys look at how to get water elsewhere, because we need energy for this country. This country wants to industrialize, so we need energy. So please allow the water to come down. Nairobi will say, well, don't you understand that Nairobi holds more than half of the Kenyan economy? And of course, power is part of that economy. So those are some of the challenges. And they take each other to court. So these are two government agencies who are taking each other to court because of competing interests. So let me leave the rest to the learned judge. Thank you.
I'd also like to comment on that. Being from Nons Valley, we have to use the courts.
Yeah.
We have to, it took us 20 years in about like 19 fighting LA Aqueduct. And at one point, they had so many mitigation projects that they weren't fulfilling that we sued for the Lawrence River project, the 63 miles of restored river. But we had to sue over it. The Nons Valley Committee and the Sierra Club sued, but we also got balled out by the judge. Or Judge Cooper just turned around and said, what took you so long? When you signed on to be a signatory, it was your job to be the watchdog and make sure these things were implemented. And when we sued over it, then he turned around and looked at DWP and he just straight off told them, it's been 11 years since you haven't implemented it. If you don't, this is like June, he goes, if you don't fix the Owens River and reestablish it as a river, I'm going to shut down a second aqueduct. You're talking about looks on my face, I'm back to going, all happy. But a judge does have a lot of power to implement existing laws, to implement all these things. If the signatory or somebody else brings that issue up to where those are agreed on principles, negotiated things. And if they don't do them, and right now there's still over 32 mitigations that haven't been done, but nobody's approached the court and just said, okay, we need to sue after them. Our judge, our lawyer, when I was on the Owens Valley Committee, he said sue them for public trust. They're violating public trust when they don't implement all of these mitigation projects. But that's why I'm not on the Owens Valley Committee anymore. They turned in kind of, to me, as a civic club. They wanted to be nice. But a judge has power, man. When he turned around and said, we'll shut down a second aqueduct, that they finished it.
If I can just make one brief, don't get me wrong, I love judges, and I'm a barrister, a litigation lawyer, so I need them. But I think judges are very good when it comes to stopping things and exercising a supervisory jurisdiction, but with the greatest of respect, they're institutionally incompetent to come up with creative ideas. And I think in this kind of area, given the urgency and the overwhelming nature of the issues, the judiciary, at least in my country, couldn't do it. It requires policymakers, and the executive really has to come up with the answers. The other aspect about the court system is the massive delay. For example, in Canada, for about 20 years, they've been trying to work out what a customary title in the foreshore and seabed amounts to. Is it a fee simple type right? Is it a use right? And I think that policymakers have to bite the bullet and deal with these sorts of issues.
Okay, so we're at an hour now. I'd like the audience to do two things. One is get up and stretch. And two is think if you have any questions you want to throw forward. So stretch break. Seriously, 2-hour panels are long. But don't go too far. So for audience people that have questions, we have a roving microphone. All right, short stretch break is now over. Please sit down again. Okay, so now I'm regretting giving you a stretch break. Is there a judge nearby that could make people stop talking? Okay, so I've got two questions, but first let me see if there are people from the audience that wanted to ask something. We've got a microphone up front. We might have a microphone in the back. Any, yes, here's one.
Well, so the point was made that that judges aren't going to come up with the creative solutions, that the creative solutions lie with the policymakers. But as somebody who's worked in government, I would say sometimes we in government are not the most creative, and it's the people closest to the challenges that may be more creative. But I guess, are there secrets of success or sort of lessons about like where these creative compromises or settlements come? I mean, the work on the Colorado River is pretty incredible that, you know, 2 countries, 7 states have figured out a way to help restore a river that was running dry. What can the rest of us learn that are dealing with these thorny issues, you know, that exist from Africa to California, 100 miles to the east?
Yeah, I think you're quite right. She keeps turning it off. You're quite right. It's not simply policy makers, and in terms of the work I was doing, a lot of the inspiration came from the local communities because they were the ones who had seen, in the case of that river, a power development that diverted a whole lot of water and basically screwed the river up. They've seen the degradation over well over a century of their fishing grounds, and so if you don't listen to people in the communities, it becomes an empty exercise by the bureaucrats in the capital city. So it's when I talk about the executive has to be prepared to, you know, act with a bit of courage, but on the basis of what they learn from the communities. No one has a monopoly of virtue or knowledge.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
I would add that in my work as a policymaker, I sometimes was reminded of something I think that Rahm Emanuel, President Obama's first chief of staff, said: never let a good crisis go to waste. And as I look at areas where there have been major muscle movements in improving community-wide efforts, it's often been after a disaster. And so, and you can see this worldwide. In the early, I think it was 1900, Japan had a terrible earthquake. They have become the disaster preparedness leaders in the world, best earthquake preparedness ever. The Dutch, who we often refer to in terms of control of water, had a terrible flood in 1953. They still, on February 1st of every year, honor those that died in that flood. And they have gone to planning for not the 1 in 100 year flood, but the 1 in 10,000 year flood. And they talk about going to the 1 in 100,000 year flood. So I wonder, in the state of California, not in the water context, but in the wildfire context, will these 2 past seasons cause California to say where we build matters, how we build matter, and how we take care of the landscape around where we are? I don't know if it will, but certainly these are the types of opportunities where I think you can see people move and work together to find solutions that are much more lasting than what the patchwork is as you're just doing it gradually day to day. It just takes so much longer, and it's harder.
Yeah, my attitude is, because dealing with LA and stuff, is change of building codes. Those are really important, because when you're in a desert and all of a sudden you green it all up from somebody else's water, if an earthquake happened and broke the California Aqueduct or the Cal project, they'd starve. You know, people got mad at me when I said this last drought that happened. I said, I'm glad it happened. People were like, why? What? Got all mad. I said, because it taught you reality. Where I'm from, we have tree rings up in the Bristlecone Pines. They go back 14,000 years. And they tell us there was like 25 years, 45, 75, 85-year droughts. And only 1,400 years ago, we had a 200-year drought. And we were just going into a 4-year drought. We're so dependent on water. So I look at it as regional. You change your water capture, you change the water capture, you change not only just reservoirs. See, learning off LA, because they actually went to Australia to learn water capture, but they're not going to implement it until like 2025. So my attitude is implement it today and do it tomorrow, because we don't know what can happen. Global climate change is real. And one scary part, 1872, I think, or 73, it rained for 30 days right above Bakersfield. It rained 20 feet. Today, they looked at it as it would flood the entire, all the way to here. It would flood us. Are they ready for that? They just kind of like, they threw that out there and they kind of went like, what would they do? But those are realities.
And from my perspective, it's also the crisis, and the drought conditions in the Colorado River watershed was one of the key triggers of beginning the talks between Mexico and the U.S., and that was at the same time an interesting point in favor of Mexico, because Mexico doesn't have the control of the river in reality, no? We are at the end and the last downstream user of the Colorado. So knowing that there was a whole decade of drought conditions that extended now over 2 decades, make everybody in the whole basin realize that we cannot do this either on the US side alone or on the Mexican side alone. And there were some assets that Mexico had that were valuable and would be able to help the US with their water and national security issues. And basically Mexico, in its turn, needed funding for water infrastructure, for improving efficiency in the irrigation district, because the Colorado River flows into Mexico. We receive less than 10% of river flows, but it feeds Mexico's 5th largest irrigation district in the country, and it's right across the border, no? So it was for Mexico as a matter of food security, water security. 2 states completely depend on this river in Mexico and 7 states in the US. But I think the drought conditions and also the earthquake. There was in 2010 an earthquake in the Mexicali Valley, and Mexicali is just on the same fault that crosses California. So this earthquake meant that half of the infrastructure in Mexico was damaged. The agricultural canal network was damaged. A lot of water was not being able to be used for production or productive purposes, and Mexico requested the help of the US to retain Mexico's water upstream on the dams so that Mexico can reestablish and rebuild the water infrastructure and the canal network system in Mexico. But that water that Mexico stored in US dams really became an asset that had avoided the whole basin and both countries to getting into shortage conditions in which the water needs are not going to be served because of this extended drought. So Mexico's saving was triggered by an earthquake. Saving of water was triggered by an earthquake. The funding that the US has provided through different minutes of the water treaty had helped Mexico to store more water. That in turn has benefited the US because the levels in Hoover Dam, Lake Mead, had not dropped below the level at which scarcity conditions are declared and shortage had begun. It may happen in 2020, but our interest, common interest of both countries is let's save more, let's keep more water in the upstream dams. And once in Mexico, we used to think that the water infrastructure in the US didn't really help Mexico at all. Actually, it kept Mexico from having a river flowing through Mexico. And now we also see it as a part of the infrastructure that help us have water security, national security for both countries. So it's a matter of taking advantage of crisis and also building bridges and building trusts across borders.
Also to speak to this question of creativity and finding innovation to address some of these challenges, we've heard it mentioned again and again that these are the kinds of problems and issues that, that cross many sectors, that affect local scales, larger scales, and one of the things that I think we don't do very well is talk across those scales and those differences. You know, we're used to saying that this is my lane, this is my silo, I'm an expert here. So one of the things we focus on as artists and as cultural organizers is trying to create spaces where people can come together in order to start building not just relationships, but also being able to access different views on those problems. Sometimes you need someone who's got a really on-the-ground perspective to be in conversation with someone who understands a system in a different way. And then in order to be able to go from, you know, we've got this little incubator, people are coming up with lots of ideas and creative ideas, now what? Creativity and art is like art, it's a practice. You have to practice it. You can't just decide today that you're going to do something and you've never worked together in this way. So we also talk a lot about the importance of doing small things together. And this is another benefit that art and public small-scale projects can have, is that you can, through a project like that, like perhaps designing a water bar and creating that together and staffing it together, you're actually practicing working together. You're practicing being creative together in a public space with your community. Those are tools and relationships and strategies that you can then apply to those much bigger issues. And so I'm really interested in how, you know, how can we invite that creative thinking farther upstream in these processes so that we're ready when the disaster happens to work together.
Okay, thank you very much. In the 1992 World Summit on Sustainable Development in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, one of the conventions signed was the ICCD, the International Convention to Combat Desertification. It was about droughts and related issues. And at that time, it was seen like desertification was kind of an African problem. In fact, they said that ICCD was signed for Africa, although this was a world meeting. And that means that Africa may not learn any lessons about drought or desertification from the developed world. In fact, most Africans may think that there are no droughts in the rest of the world, except except Africa. they may think like that. Recently, when I met one of the students who was in Kenya from Germany, and he told me that at the moment, I think now as we speak, Germany is going through a very serious drought at the moment. But how come that this thing is framed to look like it's an African problem? you know, that kind of thing. So that's one of the things I would like us to take note of. Now, the other issue is that drought is supposed to be the opposite of floods. There are two different ends of the continuum. But if you look at the solutions that we have been using, or what we call solutions in quotes, personally, I don't see them as, I mean, I think there's a problem with that kind of thinking. If there's a drought and people run around with maybe relief food or relief water or whatever it is that really a solution? That's the question. If there is flooding and some people are swept away and houses, and the question we ask ourselves today, or I ask myself, is that really a solution? So for me, I think that policy thinking, and I mean policy thinkers and academia like myself, we should stop looking at floods and drought as a problem, but rather as an opportunity, and frame the policy message for the people to look like that we can make opportunities out of drought, we can make opportunities out of floods. I'm saying that because there are communities in Kenya that you can predict with 100% accuracy that they are going to face a drought. And that has been done year after year. And I don't see any improvement. I don't see anything that is changing. Yeah? Yeah? I know of a community in my region where I live that is in the west of Kenya, where I was born. And every other time you hear that they build a dike to mitigate the floods. And then the dike was overrun by the water. And the government flew in with a lot of relief, of course, plus relief agencies, most of them from the Western world here. And they flew in and they gave people blankets. And when the rain subsided, the story went back to square zero. And so I've been wondering, and what I've been teaching my students is, why can't we look for ways of building capital out of these floods? For example, that floodplain where people are swept away every year, every rain season, why can't we convert it into a conservation area? Tell communities to form maybe some kind of a conservation trust, own shares in that particular trust, and move away from the area. They can get land from somewhere. I think government can put in some money. We can also ask our friends to do so. Because at the end of the day, there will be no floods, and the conservation area will kind of generate a new livelihood. It will even go a long way to kind of combat poverty and those kind of things. So why can't we have that holistic kind of thinking instead of always saying flood is coming, so please build a dike? Yeah, build a dike, and when the floods come, the dike is gone. Yeah, yeah. So those are some of the things I've been telling my students, that we need to, just like one of my fellow speakers said, we have to move out of these knowledge silos. What people have taught in classroom for many years, but it just isn't making any positive change. The more things seem to change, the more they remain the same. So where are you going to? Thank you. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So I had a question about the use of markets as a tool to deal with water issues, but I also wanted to pair that with a question about different valuations or value systems for water, because not everybody agrees that water is a commodity or ought to be bought and sold in a market. So to the degree that you've thought about or implemented water markets or experienced water markets in your areas, I'd love to hear.
Well, that has been some of my work. Thanks to the interest of restoring in-stream flows in the Colorado River, we began and we created the Colorado River Delta Water Trust. So basically we fundraise for funds in the US and in Mexico, but mostly US funds, to acquire water rights in Mexico in the irrigation district and dedicate them exclusively for restoration and of the river and of native riparian habitats. So we use the water market in the Mexicali irrigation district. It's a very well developed. The legal framework is right there in Mexico. But we went one step further, and we wanted to create this and expand this water trust, the first one in Mexico, from a binational perspective, because at the end of the day, the Delta is an ecosystem and it's a resource, that has an international importance for species, endangered species or protected species that cross the border, no? So at the end of the day, what we have learned is that we can use the water market in Mexicali, we can use the funding that we can acquire in the US and through donations, and select and dedicate some in-stream flows, but the water markets are not going to be the sole solution for restoring in-stream flows to the Delta. We needed both governments. We needed government water, or we needed federal waters to also help and match our water portfolio that we had, and that was one of the key points in the negotiations between the US and Mexico for this the current way of facing the drought conditions in the watershed, no? So it's interesting that they help, and from our perspective, it's kind of innovative from the perspective of the Mexican experience. It's common, kind of, in Western US water and water states, Western states, but it's not that common, and going one step above and building it as a binational water trust is taking some time, but we know that is not the sole solution. There are other tools. The legal framework is there. We try to stay away from courts, using the legal framework, but stay away from courts, precisely because when you face somebody across a table, it's easier in a way, or less difficult, to build trust and to find common ground, to express your negotiables, to reach into an agreement that may satisfy not completely what you wanted, but some or the most key issues. When you go to court, not necessarily you can reach that, or you can build resiliency in this basin, or really through collaboration in this basin. So it's, from my perspective, the last resource. It can be a very good one when there is nothing else to do. But if you can, instead of, you can avoid it, and you can sit at the table and invite people and be inclusive on those talks, I think that's key.
I think water markets certainly is an idea that gets a lot of interest. The pricing of our water appears to be inaccurate, and if we had higher prices placed on water, we'd have more conservation, and that would greatly help us in dealing with the fact that we don't have enough water. But creating such a system, particularly in the West, I think would be very difficult. A robust system, given all the different rights. But beyond that, in all of this discussion, we have to think about those that are most vulnerable. And we impose a market system that is going to be difficult for those who have fewer means. And that's just true everywhere in climate. It's going to hurt the most vulnerable the worst. So to the extent we explore markets, we have to be very sensitive that it could have some unintended consequences for a lot of people who simply don't have the resources to be able to actively engage in the markets in a way that's effective for them.
This seems unrelated, but I have a water bar where we give away water for free. And as you were talking about wanting the table for people to be across to have those negotiations, I think that's really subversively, secretly what we're doing all the time. But we talk a lot about the price of water. It's one of the things that comes up, and one of the things that I think we're trying to find creative solutions to have that conversation in a public way that addresses a lot of the complexities that you're talking about, which is that every place is different and has different issues, and then people are impacted differently. And so we've been doing some research now with some of our partners about what it would mean to start to think about what if we put tap water in a can. And we were talking about this earlier, and we posed a challenge to people in the form of paying for it like you would pay for bottled water, but it's just tap water, and thinking about how moving the profit structures then from bottled water companies who are taking water from public systems, making a big profit on it, and then moving it to other watersheds. And we said, let's keep it in the watershed. Let's think about keeping that money there too, so that the profit that goes from selling the convenience of water in a can can also fund environmental justice initiatives that would hopefully bring more people to the table. So this is just an example of, taking this question, let's use a creative platform that is something we can collaborate on at a small scale, and then see where we go from there to talking about the much bigger issues at play.
Well, I haven't done much work in this area, but I have just a few thoughts. First of all, we need to acknowledge that water is good from ecosystems. Water will only be available if ecosystems remain healthy and functional. That's the only way water will continue to be available to us. But coming to the water markets, we will be asking ourselves maybe how does the water market look like as compared to other markets we know? For a long time, and I think maybe it's the same in America, but in Kenya, we know that water is a social good. It should not be sold. If you ask the Nairobi Water Company, they will tell you that no, they don't sell water. They only charge rates which are enough to pay the loans and pay the salaries and deliver service. That's what they say. But what has emerged in Kenya, for example, and in Nairobi, is the informal water market. The water markets have been so informalized. In fact, the informal market has become much bigger than the formal one. So you'll find that there are lots of people who are selling water in containers, 20-liter containers or 50-liter containers. And because of this, because of the informal market, water has increasingly gained some kind of capitalist, capitalist value, something like that. Yeah. And so we are trying to get water. I mean, we are trying to define water as a social good, but is it really? Yeah, the capitalist interests have taken over long ago. I mean, let me be frank. Let me be a little bit frank, more frank. I mean, the capitalist interests in water have taken over. In Nairobi, people are buying water 20-liter jerrycan. They're buying water at sometimes as high as $1. That's 100 Kenya shillings. They're buying this water, and in the houses we are being rationed. Like myself, I get water once every week, just once. If it misses to come, I have to buy that water. Yeah, if I'm supposed to get it on Wednesdays, and on that Wednesday the water doesn't come, then I have to buy it. Yeah, and the water vehicle, we call it water boosters. We call them water boosters. This guy will come and he will tell me, I want to fill your reserve tank up there in the house. And how much? 1,000 shillings. That is like $10. And I say, why? He says, well, are you buying or you're not buying? In other words, I'm being told, if you don't want to buy, there is a lot of demand, so we don't want to waste time with you. Can we put for you the water or we go? Okay? So I'm forced to buy this water. I don't know anything about the source of this water, where it's coming from. I don't know anything about the quality. I don't know anything about whether the vehicle carrying it has been properly inspected, whether it's clean to carry water for human use. And so these are, to me, I see this as challenges of the market. Yeah, these are challenges of the market, an informal market which is not under any regulation by the government. So those are some of the thoughts I have about market. Thank you very much.
I'd like to make a quick comment on there too.
Yeah.
About like 1998, I was on our tribal council and I was flying to Washington, D.C. And they give us a little water, but it's a crystal geyser. And I'm going like, and they had just made a plant, like below Olanchitz, by those like dry lake. And I was kind of like, that water is going to go around the world. Now they're taking 20,000 acre feet of water. If you don't know what an acre foot is, it's just acre, 1 foot high. Consider that like a football field going 20,000 acre feet up. And that's what it's about. So within the last 10 years, our county allowed them to take 10,000 acre feet, so that now they got 20,000 acre feet. But it just killed the area. I mean, old 100-year-old cottonwoods are all dead, all the meadows, all the stuff that used to be there, they're dead. And then the county doesn't care because they got tax money. So it's an example of a commodity that everybody thinks they need bottled water now. And, 16 ounces of water is about like $1.80. You put that into a gallon, that's, man, you're making some money. But that's just the way the world is, You advertise, we say, you got to drink the good water, you got to drink this. And sometimes I think of my reservation, because we could bottle our water in my reservation, but we haven't done that, and we're kind of like, we revere water, it's sacred. But I think it's a human right myself.
And I was just going to mention that even though we all think we need bottled water, our public infrastructure is underfunded in a lot of communities as well. So it's kind of a paradox about that.
Let me open it up again to audience questions. Looks like a couple. Why don't we get all the questions asked, and then we will get answers to all the questions at once, just because we have about half an hour left.
Yeah. Plus, I actually don't have any question, and that's your fault. There's way too much thing to unpack. It was a really interesting panel, and thanks for the organizers. A really inspiring one as well, and my colleague and I this morning, when we made intervention, it was really technical ones or institutional ones, and here it inspired maybe a more philosophical approach. The issue of languages was brought up a lot of time. And one of the intervention reminded me of a famous Native American quote. I think it was Alanis Obomsawin, but I'm not sure the name, I got it right, from an Abenaki tribe, saying, when the last tree is cut, when the last fish is caught, and when the last river goes dry, you will realize that you cannot eat money. It's a very important quote, and when I was mentioning languages, it's not just the local languages that most of you have brought up, but also how we address the world. We, as practitioners of the governance sector, we tend to just bring our knees to the ground and recognize the world we live in, and it's a world in which international diplomacy respect the dominant model, the dominant language, which is realpolitik. That is one where only the issue of security risk can attract the interest of governments, of states, and you clearly brought that up with the case of the Chad. People got interested in the management of the Chad River Basin because Boko Haram find a very fertile ground to grow in there. Maybe many of you know that it was the same problem with the Syria civil war. The U.S. National Space Agency has explained that the country in Syria was experiencing the biggest drought of the past 500 years, and this has brought millions of people from the countryside to the city, And it's because the government was unable to reply to the demand of job, of water, of food, then you had this uprising. It was a trigger effect. I don't think it's the only cause, of course, but it was a trigger effect. So we have to address this security risk. We have to adopt that language clear. We also have to adopt a language of economy, because the other dominant model, the other dominant language is the one of capitalism. And I'd rather go with that word than the word market, because market is good. But capitalism is indeed a problem. And we have to, again, put our knees to the ground and talk about economic risks. When the Global Economic Forum mentioned that for the past 7 years, it was reminded again this morning, the top 5 priority risk, water is in there. So that's something that talks to the states. But there's a time when we shouldn't just put our knees down. It's okay to adopt that language, but we shouldn't give up on the one of common sense. We cannot eat money. And this is something that even in international relations and in international conferences, we have to remind to our audiences. Because at the end of the day, the supply chain of the companies and the trade that states are doing, it won't be possible when all is left is dust. So it's not really a question, and it's probably too long of a comment, but I would have to thank you again.
Hi, I do have a question, and is the case for the river in New Zealand, where you give them legal personality. The question that arises is who makes decisions and how those decisions are made on behalf of the river?
There's an organization, well, the river is recognized as indivisible, own legal personality, represented in court hearings by 2 people who are appointed by the various tribes for their knowledge of what is called tikanga Māori, or the Māori way of thinking, and also people who one can expect that they're appointments by the state. One is appointed by the state for 5 years, one is appointed by the various Māori tribes, and they have standing to represent the river if, for example, there was an application for a consent to take water from the river. So as with a company which acts through its directors, or a trust which acts through its trustees, it's a similar sort of concept. And I must emphasize that this is we haven't sort of created legal persons all around the country. This is the first river that we've moved on in the context of a treaty settlement. There have been other forms of redress with other tribes for co-governance regimes with the regional council over a river or matters such as that. But in this case, we were responding to the particular aspirations of the people and the history of the river, which is why we came up with the solution.
My question, it's part an observation, then also a question. The observation is there's been a lot of infrastructure projects that have taken place that have, in a sense, killed a culture, killed a people, killed a language. Just recently, the Three Gorges Dam in China displaced hundreds of thousands of people, and for the sake of energy, for long-term growth, but it also damaged the environment and displaced the people. And in the process of displacing a people, you displace a history. You look at the Shasta Dam in California, displaced the people. In a sense, it flooded cultural sites and lost a history. And the stories amount, and you keep on going around the world, and there's a lot of contention and massive mega projects, where in Brazil, in Mexico, and this process of culture killing also create incites in a way violence. And when people resist, there's death, there's torture. And in cases of Mexico, there's enforced disappearance of persons when they're protecting water or natural resources. When you look in your respective fields, all of you come from distinct backgrounds. How do we look at water, and how do we go about water now with climate change? And you have mega infrastructure projects that have destroyed the environment, but in a sense have also contributed to, in a sense, a larger picture of just climate change in general, where people are being displaced by drought, and they're going to neighboring countries, neighboring cities, trying to seek this invaluable resource, and the host country or the host city or the host state cannot accommodate, and then creates, in a sense of violence and urgency for this natural resources, and in a sense, destroying history, culture, and whatnot.
I'd like to say something on that. The world's biggest problem is man has become a pestilence on the face of the earth. It's that simple. And that is responsible by our religions, our choosing to chase gold and commodities and doing all that stuff. Because everybody used to just want to be a millionaire, now they all want to be billionaires. But it takes customers. So the more people we have, the more customers we have. And that has to change. And the only thing to change that is educating people.
From our perspective, as you saw, we have people from the agricultural valley, from the rural communities of the Delta working in restoration projects in different areas of restoration, from plant growing, native trees, planting them, measuring water deliveries, a lot of things that they are helping us. And one of the things that we realize in this Binational Water Trust, the name in Spanish is Restauremos el Colorado, is that a lot of the people that work with us in restoring the river probably had lived in the U.S. as migrant agricultural workers before. And at one time or another, they return back to Mexico to visit their families, their relatives. When they find a safe place to work with a decent salary, with a community that they find they can keep their family ties very close, when they see that the nearby ecosystem is somewhere that inspires them, they stay. So even though a lot of people are facing or being forced to migrate and to leave families behind and to look for safety or to look for economic well-being outside of their communities, far away from their relatives, there's always a pathway to go back if we can build those type of safety nets. And on those safety nets, the health of an ecosystem is very much tied to the health of a community. That's.
So with climate change, one of the biggest immediate security concerns will be migration. Essentially the think tank for the federal government intelligence agencies said it could be unprecedented levels. The fear is the hardening of countries as a result of that, and the difficulties that occurred after the Syrian drought, and that wasn't the sole cause. There was a lot of actually water management problems in Syria, but a contributing cause. What our European allies have deeply struggled with that. So the most important takeaway, I think, for security folks who think about this is how do you stop that from occurring? How do you help the folks in the Lake Chad area handle their water issues, come to the governance issues, so that we can, for the most part, keep everyone where their cultural roots are, where they have the family ties. As we see with migration, it's very difficult for the people who are forced to leave if it's involuntary. Of course, they're trapped populations at home, very unhappy, they're very vulnerable populations, and then for the receiving communities. It's a very complex issue. Interestingly, Bangladesh, one of the most challenged nations in the world with sea level rise, they are among the most innovative. They're talking about, at a very early stage, twinning of cities. So they'll actually have land disappear. There's just going to be, it's not even a drought. There's just no place to live. The water will come in and the land will be gone. But rather than have all the people go to Dhaka, which is already underwater basically, or very threatened by salinization and sea level rise and one of the fastest growing mega cities in the world, twin up with other cities in the interior so that as migrants begin to leave, that infrastructure has been built in those areas to receive them. But if you even look at the United States, our coastal regions, there'll be massive retreat from them. And we haven't figured out, there's been some great academic work about where they think the folks will go, Austin, Atlanta, elsewhere, but there's been no thought about how do we invest in those communities so that they're ready to embrace and preserve as much as we can of their relationships rather than being perceived as an outsider who's somehow using up the resources that I have. No easy answers to this, but unfortunately it's happening very quickly, and it will be upon us very shortly.
Just as you said, a lot of the decisions that will be part of climate adaptation are really unpleasant decisions. Allocating scarcity, allocating risk, rising prices, all of those things. And I wonder if you've observed a level of government that deals with those better. Perhaps people think of the state as too distant and too autocratic, or they think of locals as not having the capacity or the ability to face their neighbors in close contact to make these hard decisions. And I'm wondering if you've noticed a level of government that can approach them, or an alternative.
That's actually an excellent closing question. So I'd love to have everybody address sort of that scale question, but this is going to be the lightning round, so you each have, at most, 2 minutes.
Well, it seems odd that someone from a minnow country like mine, where barely 5 million, should be talking to you from a country of 300 million, but the same principle applies. We have no federal structure, and we're much simpler than you. You're a unitary state. But in my experience, the further you get away from Wellington, from the capital city, and the more you empower local communities, the better the response. So the capital city does not know everything. The Beltway doesn't have all the answers. And I think that even we're about the size of, population-wise, South Carolina. So, as I say, you have to put things in perspective, and I don't deserve 2 minutes, so I'll hurry up. But the general principle, get away from the centre, get into communities, you're going to get better responses, and government there is facilitator, listening, not thinking it has a monopoly of wisdom, then you can start to achieve a few things.
I agree. Yeah, that's the scale question. I think in general I tend to, and the folks that I work with and collaborate with, we tend to try to remember that it's all cultural, as I said. So a lot of this has to do with the cultures of those governments or of those organizations, whether you're talking at this level or that level, and also remembering that it's people and who the people are who are in those positions making those decisions matters. And so how do we start to create more accessible government in the sense that we're changing the composition of who those people are in a way. And so one quick example from Minneapolis, where we're based, is that we've been working with our local government, our city government, on climate preparedness and resilience efforts. And we've been helping the city try to figure out how to better prepare people in our local community for severe weather events, which in our neighborhood and community is flooding and heat waves and things of this nature. And so as relationship builders, we said, well, you need to be listening to the people who are most impacted. And so we were able to convince, through that trust, the city to work with an artist named Amake Kubat, who has a Yo Mama's Water Bar and a Yo Mama Mothering Mothers Institute. And she said, what if women of color who are most impacted mothers in our communities were the ones making the emergency preparedness kits and workshops? And the city let her redesign that and say what should be in it. So it wasn't saying that the government needed to better help the people. It was that the people had wisdom that they needed that the government needed to hear. And so we have to find ways to sort of flip those ideas around. And I think that's true at whatever scale, but maybe locally it's easier to take those risks and try new things.
So I would agree, the local level seems to be the most effective. I think that reflects that humans are social animals, and there's a lot to do with building trust, and the more you know someone, the more likely you'll feel trust. The challenge with climate change is that we have built all these jurisdictional boundaries that are completely artificial, that reflect that initial trust, the county lines, the city lines, the municipality. And climate change comes in across all of them. And as we've been talking about in these water basins, we need to plan together. So unfortunately, and you right out in the bay in San Francisco Bay, 100 cities surrounding that bay, in the most progressive area, in the area most focused on climate change in the United States, and no agreement as to even how much sea level rise they should plan for. So that tells me that we got to get over ourselves. Now, who can figure out how we get over ourselves will solve this problem, because then we will come up with some solutions. But right now, we can't even figure out in one of the most wealthy areas in the world, facing a significant threat, the very basic step of what do we need to plan for.
And in my perspective, and in a binational watershed, I think all levels of government are going to be needed and important, and not just government. No, when you transcend boundaries, when you have different legal frameworks and court systems and economic markets and everything, you have to include everybody and all levels of government. But the most effective ones in terms of restoring the rivers, what I've seen is local communities having the opportunity to participate and to be included in the decision-making process.
I look at it as living in a balance. We have got out of the way of living in a balance. We depend, there's wants and needs, and everybody wants more than they need. And that's one of the things that just human education of themselves. And then I look at it as building codes and stuff like that, but living in a region. Right now, the San Joaquin Valley, they consider it the breadbasket of the world. That's going to be infected by the ocean rise. So where's all that food going to come from? We should look at different areas, regions. You have to take care of yourself. Protect your water. Use only so much water. Grow your own food. But that's a way long term, but that's just a thought that I've always had. And that's what we need to do. Well, we do it. It may take 100 years. It'll probably take a lot of pain, a lot of lives, a lot of stuff before we really realize you have to live with Mother Earth. Because if you don't live with her, she don't care if she lives with us. You don't take care of the Mother Earth, she ain't going to take care of us, and that's happening right now. I'm glad we're not on the East Coast right now. We'd be having a hurricane hitting us. Maybe it'll wake some people up, but that's the balance of life of the world. You change it a little bit, hey, it reacts. Straight physics. For every option, for every action, there's equal and an opposite reaction, and that's what is happening right now. And it's a tough pill to take, but if we are to survive, that's the only way it's going to happen, to look at, okay, take care of everybody or live. Or, if only the rich can survive, who's going to serve them their food? There's things like that. Who's going to pick their fruit? Who's going to do all this stuff? Oh, I'm so rich, I've never learned anything but spend money. That's way out of balance. That's the part that I have hope. I've always had hope that humanity will survive. Because this is our only place, this is our only home. We don't take care of it. We just dirtied up our house, and then bugs are going to move in. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Just a little bit back before I come to her question, a little bit to his question. Development-induced displacement and resettlement, DIDR. I think the issues around DIDR, development-induced displacement and resettlement, have had a long history. Maybe climate change is just a new factor, what I call as an aggravator of those already existing issues. Because of time, let me not go so much into it, but climate change has brought about a new dimension in DIDR, that is development-induced displacement and resettlement. Long ago, when we could build big projects, like along the Tana, the Gesai Cave, the first dams, like the big, when a big dam was built, people were told to leave and create space for the dam. And later on, some of them could not leave where they were relocated, and they had to come back. There is a case in the Tana where old women had to come back. They had to come back and live just around the dam because they couldn't really make it. So DIDR is not a new issue as such. With respect to participation, local communities, in Kenya, let me still give an example of Kenya. We think that participation needs a framework. That's what we think, that participation of local communities need a framework. And consultants don't want to hear me talk like that. We have been calling them revolving chair consultants. Yeah, because if you're talking about participation, you are infringing on spaces that the government should use, maybe sometimes to get its way. Not many governments want communities to be so enlightened. Let me put it in quotes. To be so enlightened, to know what their rights are, and so to an extent, as soon as somebody has increased awareness among communities and probably helped them to participate more in projects, then I realized that the politicians came up with a new tactic. Well, he's a politician. They came up with a new tactic. And so they started campaigning using these projects as a source of votes. So yes, they have said that you're not participating, but you see, it's me who knows what you guys really need. And just give me votes because I'll be speaking somewhere there, either in parliament or somewhere. Yeah, I'll be speaking for you. So increasingly, while we say communities should participate in these projects, but politicians are always evolving and are normally ahead of the game, you know. So those are some of the issues about participation. Yes, we need it, but there are many challenges. There are many challenges because of because of the changing, the evolving issues around them. Yeah, thank you. Sorry.
Okay, great. So I'd like you to join me in thanking my fellow organizers and the panel. And now over to Wade.